and it's where we hold our congregation ceremonies at the end, so our students actually graduate in that building. And just in case you're not quite sure where Durham is, this slide shows you exactly where Simon and I are. We're about halfway up the island of Great Britain, not in Durham, North Carolina, which I often have to say because a lot of people think that that is where Durham University is located. As you can see, we're neither in the Midlands, which we would say is around Birmingham, or the south, or in the north. We're actually about halfway up the island. Mostly people haven't heard of us because we don't have a Premier League football team, but we do have a pretty good cricket team, and the cricket team is not doing quite so well at the moment, but it has won the county championship, which is our big national tournament, in a number of occasions. And this is the last time that they won it in 2013. So if you think of Durham, think of cricket and not North Carolina. So that's the connection. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is some work I've been doing on pedagogical content knowledge, and particularly a piece on research and policy related to improving teacher quality. I've given this lecture in various formats in a number of places around the world in the last 12 months, and I brought it to Michael's attention. Michael, when he invited me, I thought this would be a good topic to raise with SERG and the Royal Society of Chemistry education community. So I hope that you find this of interest. My reason for starting this is because, as Michael alluded to, I was a chemistry teacher originally, and my interest started with chemistry knowledge, teacher chemistry knowledge, and how students learn that knowledge. My subsequent work as a teacher educator led me to question this in a little bit more depth, and hopefully you'll see from the presentation how I've been questioning it over the last few years. So this is the format for the talk. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction. We're going to have then 3 lessons which I've picked out. One is about pedagogical content knowledge, or PCK itself. The second one is about impressions of PCK. What does PCK look like from research? And that's a piece of empirical work that I've done. And then the third one is on international teacher education policy, which again is a piece of work that I've been working on for the last couple of years. And what we're going to do is draw together those points in a conclusion. I think I'm going to stop after lesson 2 for questions, so that'll be hopefully about halfway through the talk, if that's okay. So lesson 1 then is all about what we expect from our teachers, and a number of years ago we had quite an energetic, shall we say, education secretary who was called Michael Gove, working in England. In Scotland, I have to say, the jurisdiction is slightly separate, so education is treated separately, but he was a very energetic education secretary, and he had quite a lot to say about what he thought teachers were and should be, and their role in society. And I found his comments here that I've listed here are actually quite powerful statements. He says they hold in their hands the success of a country and the well-being of its citizens. They're the most important fighters in the battle to make society an opportunity equal. And I like this one too, the critical guardians of the intellectual life of a nation, and giving children the tools by which they can become authors of their own life story. And teachers are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. Now, these are all very, very lofty and noble statements. What we need, if that is going to be reality, is to really think about how that is backed up in terms of the policy related to training teachers and then making sure that policy is effective. It's clear as well from my reading that this is a topic that is really of international concern. And just today I was putting together this slide, and it wasn't difficult to find really quite powerful quotes of a similar nature from quite a range of nations around the world. The sources for these I can send on to you if you really want them. But in Norway, they're discussing this notion of teacher quality, predicting instructional quality, and linking to student achievement. In America, a document written even 10 years ago, and this is not by Linda Darling-Hammond, it was by another team, saying that teachers contribute to students' academic growth, recognising differences between teachers, and the notion that improving student learning is the notion that is the information that educational policies need, how actually to really achieve that. Singapore, which comes regularly top of a number of international surveys, we're talking about teacher quality being key. And then in Australia, the effective classroom teacher is crucial and critical to the future of young Australians. So this is a topic which is really of common interest. Again, what I'm hoping that you'll get out of this is perhaps some strategies and ideas about what we need to do internationally in the community for making sure our teachers are of the best quality. So let's start by thinking about how we might approach that question. So here's a piece of work that was done by Chris Husbands, who at the time was head of the Institute of Education in London. He's now moved on to be Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam University. And he was saying that the most important school-related factor in pupil learning, and the answer is teaching. And he put together this notion of what a quality teacher might look like, and he was doing it from the point of view of a number of factors that had come out in the literature on a regular basis to determine how good a quality teacher is. And as the South Koreans famously said a number of years ago, the quality of the country's education system can't exceed the quality of its teachers. So this is perhaps quite an important indicator for how we might start to think about teacher quality. So Chris Husbands was saying there's a combination of commitment, effective pedagogy, knowledge of subject, knowledge of teaching, and then perhaps the physics factor, the constant at the end, this notion of imagination, teachers being imaginative and being able to do something in their classrooms which perhaps nobody else has tried before, simply because they feel and know that it's right in that setting. Now, obviously, putting that equation together on a consistent basis is slightly problematic, so it's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek equation. But what we can say is that there is evidence that teacher preparation is often based on these kinds of strategies. It's often based on a knowledge deficit model. In other words, this idea that we're filling up teachers or would-be teachers with knowledge that they need to know in some way about behaviour, classroom management, special needs, all sorts of other things that might be useful in the classroom. I know that our teacher education programmes seem to have sessions on all these things. There's also a heavy reliance on master-apprentice, this idea of a teacher going into a classroom. Michael Gove famously made this point about sitting by Nelly. So those of you listening from the UK may well remember that. And this notion of sitting at somebody's feet or in their classroom, learning how to do the job. That's a little bit hit and miss, and we could spend more time discussing that. But I want to just set that out in the context of the talk. There's also perhaps an assumption that raising the standard of the entrance automatically produces better quality teachers. In other words, if we ask for teachers to come into teaching with a very high standard bachelor's degree, they're automatically going to be better than those who don't have that kind of background. That again perhaps tells us something about how narrow people's perspectives of what teachers are and what they do might be. There probably are a range of settings where perhaps that heavy academic background is not necessarily the right one. In England as well, we tend to have quite a short and intense training period for teacher preparation. It can be as little as 6 weeks, or it can be a 1-year full-time programme in a university or higher education institution, or perhaps even in a school. But it's not particularly necessarily a long-term business. And what we need to reflect on is whether these preparation methods actually really do produce the top quality teachers that we really need. And perhaps we'll return to that as a question a little bit later. Nevertheless, the impact on student achievement is quite clear, and we can see that the way teachers perhaps are trained and prepared for the classroom does have an impact on the outcomes of those systems. So, for example, in the PISA survey in 2015, Singapore ranked first, and 39.1 of the top performers in science, reading and mathematics were in the top class, I should say, and compared to the OECD average of 15.3%. So they were way above the standards of most other nations. In this survey, just for the benefit of the UK listeners, the UK was ranked 15th. And that's quite interesting when we think that the UK is one of the 6 biggest economies in the world. We're still not achieving as highly as Singapore. Well-developed nations with average performance included the USA, France and Sweden. Again, other nations which have got heavy investment in education, perhaps to a differing degree. But nonetheless, perhaps some of these performers are not doing as well as we might expect just on the basis of investment. In England, just to put a little bit more precision on this, 61% of 16-year-olds achieved what we've regarded as a threshold pass in any science in GCSE. And if we just look more broadly across the set of GCSE results, 53.5% achieved 5 or more GCSEs at C or over. And we can see significant evidence that social disadvantage plays a role here, in that those who receive free school meals, which in the UK or England is a marker for poverty, only 67% of those 11-year-olds achieve threshold in reading, writing and mathematics, compared to 83% of non-disadvantaged children. So whatever we've got in our system in England and elsewhere in the world is not really doing perhaps as well as we might expect. So what can we learn about teacher education policy and practice from some of the top nations? Let's look at these outcomes in a little bit more detail. What we can say is that teacher education generates variable quality programs. So as of 30th of June 2017, when I last updated this particular slide, 38% of secondary and 41% of primary initial teacher education programs in England were graded as outstanding by our inspection system. Now, that doesn't seem to me to be that many when we've got quite a lot of programs. We can also say that there is evidence that the gap in achievement between students taught by the best and weakest teachers can be as much as 2 years learning time. So having the best teachers really does matter for student achievement. And I think overall what we can say is that a knowledge-based, short-term, master-apprentice teacher preparation model has little impact on raising student achievement. If it was truly effective, those countries like England, which have made significant investments in teacher education and their education systems generally, ought to be performing better than they are. So my argument here is that there is another reason, there is something, an underlying reason that is defining teacher quality. A few years ago, some colleagues here in Durham undertook a study, a review of research on this area, and they looked at what makes great teaching, and the report is easily accessible on the internet, and you can pick that out if you wish to. They defined great teaching as that which leads to improved student progress, in other words, perhaps better progress than we might have expected given the nature of the students. And what they found was in this meta-review that 6 teacher quality components impact consistently on student progress. These are the 6, starting from the bottom, number 6, and working our way up. So they looked at teacher beliefs, they found those have some impact. Professional behaviours also have some impact. They found that classroom climate has a moderate impact, and by this they mean that teacher-student interactions have a role to play, creating a demanding learning environment which sets expectations for students' achievement, and valuing effort and resilience is also a moderate factor in the classroom environment. Let's move on to the top 3. And what we see here is classroom management, a teacher who is capable of controlling the resources and behaviour of the students and using time efficiently has a moderate impact on students' achievement. And the 2 that come out regularly at the top and which clearly were most impactful on student achievement in this meta-review were quality of instruction, which the reviewers said included effective questioning, using assessment, embedding learning, having time to practice and using model answers. And then right at the top is pedagogical content knowledge. The authors put a bracket around this because they were not certain, as we'll come to see a little bit later on, about what the interaction between content and pedagogy, but they were able to pin down factors such as deep subject knowledge, below threshold knowledge impeding students' learning. So in other words, teachers who have weak knowledge of their subjects don't help students learn. Understanding of students' thinking, sort of being able to interpret what students are perhaps going on in their minds when they approach certain concepts, and understanding students' misconceptions. So this leads us to the conclusion that there is something there about pedagogical content knowledge which seems to be crucial in designing teacher preparation systems for high quality performance. So let's move on a little bit to the notion of pedagogical content knowledge itself. So what is PCK? It was proposed originally by Lee Schulman as a special amalgam of content and pedagogy. He was talking to teachers in a large conference in the States, and many of you will probably know this already. And he identified PCK as the missing connection in teacher knowledge. And subsequently, a lot of work has been done on what PCK actually is. Schulman's original model is shown in this slide, and he really boiled it down to two things: teachers holding representations or instructional strategies, and the knowledge of students' subject matter learning difficulties. And as you can see, each of those has a number of components. We've got analogies, explanations, illustrations and demonstrations, and then on this side, knowledge of that student's misconceptions and knowledge for the barriers to learning. He was unclear about the interconnection between the two, but nonetheless that was his original model. Of course, other workers were not satisfied with this, such as the nature of education research. People decide to develop ideas and collect data and so forth. So here is another model which is still very popular today in the literature, even though it's now nearly 20 years old. This will extend the number of components of teacher knowledge to 5 and extends it into this notion of which shapes. So this idea of linking everything back to orientation to teaching science. In other words, what a teacher thinks science ought to look like shapes how they deliver it. So perhaps we might have somebody who's a very investigative scientist who takes that forward and does a lot of investigations. But you can see here some elements of Schulman's model and also extensions to his model. More recently, people have tried to work on this a little bit further because the range of models that came into being has been problematic. And perhaps the most recent settled model is this one. It's known colloquially as the consensus model. It was published in 2012 following a pedagogical content knowledge seminar held in Colorado. And what we can see here is that actual personal PCK that teachers enact in the classroom is in this little section here. But you can also see there's a lot of different types of knowledge bases which go into contributing to PCK itself. And we can see that these 5 at the top here develop something the model calls topic-specific professional knowledge, and it's amplified and filtered through teachers' beliefs and orientations, delivered in the classroom, is amplified and filtered again by the students, and then results in student outcomes. What I want to do to some extent in the rest of the talk is to test this model out a little bit, as it is the most recent that we have. So what we can see is that if we can compare and contrast these 3, there are some different aspects of the model which are worth paying attention to. The Schulman model relies on precise case knowledge and has 2 components. It doesn't explain the connections, doesn't include student outcomes, and there's no empirical evidence for it at that time. In fact, there's no empirical evidence for any really of these 3 models really. They're mostly constructed on the basis of a range of research, but not directly evidence-based. I've outlined here the number of components, the notion of the idea of which shapes and the idea that connections are unexplained, and the only one that has student outcomes is the consensus model. So far we can conclude, I think, that PCK probably is a useful construct. It does have potential to contribute significantly to our understanding of teacher education, and that came through very clearly from the Rob Coe et al. Review. But it is fuzzy, it does exhibit some uncertainty. This range of models is quite problematic. So what does it really look like in a teacher's practice? And then I've raised these other questions. How does PCK relate to teaching quality? How does it relate to student learning? In what ways is it represented in teacher standards and education policy statements and documents? If it's that important, it really ought to be there. So let's go on to the second lesson and look at impressions of PCK from research. So what I'm going to tell you about now is a piece of work that I did with pre-service teachers, and I gave them a number of vignettes to try to answer, just to try and get a sense of what kind of things they thought would be useful to do in terms of addressing students' misunderstandings about very specific chemical or scientific concepts. I gave them 1 vignette each in chemistry, biology and physics, and this is the chemistry one. Now, looking back with hindsight, I possibly wouldn't have done it in this way, but as you can see on this slide, I gave them this picture of magnesium burning in oxygen, various students' responses, and asked the teacher, or the would-be teacher, what would you do to help students learn the scientifically correct answer? And I'll show you shortly the range of responses that we got. This is the biology question, and this is the physics question, so we don't need to worry too much about those. I just wanted you to see that they were there, and you can look at these slides again a little bit later. So this tells you a little bit about the number of students that I had. They were all bachelor's degree scientists. They'd all got good qualifications at GCSEs and A-level. They'd all been interviewed, and they were all Durham University, PGCE, a teacher education programme, people coming in for that programme. So let's have a look at what kinds of things they said. So we're just going to focus on the chemistry vignette just now. And the way I analysed this was to look at the kind of content knowledge that they had. So if we're talking about pedagogical content knowledge and subject matter knowledge, I thought we needed to see whether they actually have accurate chemical content knowledge. If they're going to teach chemistry, they ought to know the answer to this question, really. And I found a variation in the quality of their knowledge. So some of the students said, okay, a mixture forms. Clearly, if you know your chemistry, that's clearly wrong, so I coded that as incorrect. Some of them said something which was kind of vaguely right, and you could see that they had some idea, but it wasn't really what you might say was really useful if you were going to teach this topic. So here's what I called at the top: correct, relevant, and complete. Somebody who'd said something like, magnesium oxide is the new substance, it's formed from oxygen and air and elemental magnesium, metals and oxygen react to produce oxides. There's some idea there about what is actually going on. And I've graded that increase in quality. I also had a look at the kind of pedagogical strategies they proposed, and these were mixed. Again, bearing in mind these are pre-service teachers, I still did give them, I suppose, fairly harsh grading, but I wanted to try and get to the heart of what actually might work in the classroom. So some of the students didn't say anything, they just wrote a little bit of subject knowledge, but some of them said these kinds of things. They said, oh, well, perhaps I'd show that mass increases or that burning produces oxides, or I might illustrate the model reaction with Lego bricks. Some of them had rather odd ideas about carbon dioxide not supporting combustion, or using the analogy, it's like mixing paint or making a cake. And then there was this group of relevant ones. So these kinds of things I felt actually probably would have impact if they were done in the classroom. Repeat the experiment, discuss magnesium oxide as a product, state that magnesium oxide is formed, draw particle diagrams so they get the notion of microscopic event taking place, and use students' responses to analyse misconceptions. So when we start to put this together, we can see that if we think of pedagogical content knowledge as an amalgam of content and pedagogy, we can see that there are limited combinations of these two which are likely to lead to student learning. If we have any point where pedagogy or content is poor or wrong or incomplete, the chances of a student learning from a teacher with that kind of knowledge is pretty low. But if we have reasonably good pedagogy and the good, correct, relevant content knowledge, the chances of students learning is pretty high, I would say, subject to other factors. So let's now look at a couple of these examples. So here's an example of poor content knowledge and correct, irrelevant PCK, which I have judged would have low impact on student learning. So this is the PGCE, the initial teacher education students' answer to the question. So I've taken out some little bits here, but just to make sense of it. But this is what the student said, and you can read that what she was saying was try again, burn in different gases, see if you get comparable results, and then principles of combustion with oxygen. To me, that wouldn't really get the right kind of message across. And just to point out, she was a biologist, she'd had some previous science teaching experience, and this was her first job. So here's somebody with a different kind of approach. So this person had a PhD in chemistry, she'd had some science-based teaching experience, and I judged her response to have very good content knowledge and relevant PCK. So she was starting, if you read her response, to really unpick the micro scale, the subatomic, the submicroscopic scale of the event that the students would see in front of them. And she explicitly addressed some of the misconceptions that were apparent in the students' answers. So if a teacher really did that, the chances of somebody learning it would be strong. So I think what we can say from this, and I've also just to bear in mind, I've only shown you one small example of a small piece of research which I did myself. We can say that PCK research actually in a way disagrees about what PCK is like. There are researchers around the world who have a different view of it to me. On the other hand, there is evidence that Schulman's amalgam is actually appropriate and accurate. It does enable precise strategies to be identified and use of proper instructional strategies which clearly can have impact. And I think if we consider how those trainee teachers may have changed their responses, it does permit development of PCK over time. So we can see the notion that somebody's pedagogical content knowledge would be different after 5 years of wrangling in the classroom compared to how they might have started prior to taking a teacher education programme. And I think it is probably correct to say that we can expect more of PCK in terms of enhancing teacher quality, perhaps by identifying explicit pedagogical practices. Mark Winchell in the States describes these as high leverage practices, by settling on a PCK model that functions as well in the majority of situations instead of chopping and changing between them. Right, so I think I've reached about the halfway point, so let's pause for thought and any questions.
Great, so at this stage I'll invite Simon to pick out any questions, or perhaps he has his own. Let's see,
okay, so first question we have on here, it relates to, obviously, in terms of just about the lack of evidence to support these models, and a question about in terms of measuring impact through student outcomes, and the fact that student outcomes are norm referenced. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, Vanessa, in terms of relating sort of work you're doing there to student impact.
Okay, I think, well obviously, I mean, student impact is kind of measured by national assessments, but I think quite a lot of the work, as you'll see in the second half of the talk, is done by looking at outcomes from international assessments. In an international assessment, students will take a standard test, and we can judge outcomes, I think, reasonably fairly by the outcomes of that test. Of course, there are limits to the tests. There's limits to reliability, validity, and the kind of choice of questions and the style of questions that are put into those tests. But an international test, I think, does give a reasonable basis for making some decisions. I think if the questioner looks back at the What Makes Great Teaching paper, we'll see how they carried out their meta review and established the connection between pedagogical content knowledge and student learning outcomes. I think that has been established in a number of different jurisdictions in a number of different ways. For instance, Linda Darling-Hammond's work in the States has been one major piece of work. There's been work in Singapore too, which has really established this. So I think it does have reasonable traction. There is a reasonable evidence base to support it.
Okay, great, thank you very much. I have a question, something I'd be certainly interested in, is in relation to the tension between trying to simplify abstract concepts, but being able to explain them without diluting the quality of vocabulary. So that kind of a issue for someone's pedagogical content knowledge in terms of approaches to that, and where the line is drawn in relation to that. Any thoughts in relation to that?
I think part of learning to teach is learning how to use language appropriately for the students in front of the teacher. I think, Simon, you and I have done your work on this. It has provided some good evidence that there is a kind of language of chemistry that teachers need to learn to speak, and they've got to learn to speak it in the way that students need to learn it too. So I would say that is part of learning to teach, and it's part of developing appropriate instructional strategies.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Perhaps we'll take one more at this point, shall we? So transferability of PCK. Are there general features of PCK that you think can be transferred between different topics, and can we measure that?
Oh, okay, that's interesting. Right, general features. Right, there is quite a bit of work that shows that there are general features in PCK, and probably just simply for brevity, I would refer the students to work that's been done in Germany, because in Germany they do have quite a strong track on looking at general knowledge, general pedagogical knowledge as part of pedagogical content knowledge. And the particular people whose work I would refer to is Knut Neumann and Stefan Storger, who are at IPM Kiel. and also Sophie Kirchner and Andreas Borowski over in, I think Andreas is in Eastern Germany. I'm not quite sure where Sophie is now, but there are some German researchers who have quite strong evidence about that. There's also evidence coming from the States. Julie Guest-Newsom's group have had work on that. And if there are any other people listening who are working on it, you perhaps want to make a note and to chip in a little bit later. So I hope that gives enough to go on just for now.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. I think we better press on with the talk, but do keep on posting questions and we'll have some time at the end to pick up some more of those. Okay, right. Thank you.
Okay, so we're getting on to lesson 3. So now I'm going to show you a piece of work that I've done about how PCK is reflected in international teacher education policies. What I've done is a piece of document analysis and some thematic analysis. I used information from 5 different nations around the world: Singapore, Finland, United States, England and Australia. I looked at teacher standards documents and other materials, and I've used the PCK consensus model. And what I was looking at in this thematic analysis was I was looking to see the extent to which within those documents elements aligned with components in the PCK consensus model, or whether there were emergent themes that did not feature in the consensus model which seemed to be important in those jurisdictions in the way they prepared their teachers. So what I'm going to take you through is the document analysis and then the thematic analysis in these 2 aspects. So let's look at the nations first, so discussing the sample a little bit first. So here's Singapore, Finland, Australia, England and the United States. Here's their PISA 2015 ranking, their TIMSS 2015 ranking for science in the 8th grades. This is roughly 13, 14-year-olds. The reason for selecting these particular countries is that they have similar GDP per capita. So I was trying to pick nations with relatively high GDPs to remove a whole host of sort of social factors which perhaps can impact on how students respond and the rankings and so on. So I was trying to find comparable nations. And what we can see here is a variation in the outcomes for those nations. So we've got Singapore at the top, Finland coming next. They didn't do TIMSS grade 8 science in 2015. And then America, England and the States are coming relatively lower down. So why is that when we've all got similar per capita ratings? My question was that I was trying to raise this with this notion of looking at teacher preparation quality. And what I've done here is I've ringed 7 different aspects of the teacher's professional knowledge base, topic-specific professional knowledge, and amplifiers and filters, in other words, teacher beliefs. And what I was trying to do here is to see the extent to which these 5 professional knowledge bases, topic-specific professional knowledge, and teacher beliefs and orientation were reflected in these jurisdictions' teacher education documents. So that's the first stage of the analysis. So let's look at what I came up with. And I'm going to tell you how I went about it. So first of all, I was looking for what I called a strong alignment. And by a strong alignment, I meant this was a major heading in standards documents regarded as perhaps very significant, or it had other equivalent evidence to suggest it was important from other documents or other literature, or it was somehow emphasised in teacher progression or qualification. What I called a weak alignment was where it was perhaps a sub or minor heading, or perhaps was ideal or aspired to. It was inferred from documents or other literature, and as I said, sorry, I'm just repeating myself there, aspirational rather than actual. So let's have a look at how those 7 elements worked out in the teacher preparation documents for those 5 nations. So that's the next slide. So what we see here is a difference in how these countries approach these 7 things. Now, I'm going to just place some caveats here because this is my interpretation of these things. What I'm not saying here is that in Singapore, external assessment isn't regarded as important, but I'm just saying in those teacher education documents, it has less emphasis than, say, it does in England, where it seems to be a very strong emphasis. So what I've got in this table is knowledge base down the sides. Those are the 7 components that came out of the consensus model. These are the 5 nations going across the top. And the way I've assessed this, it looks like these stronger nations tend to be emphasising certain aspects that we don't tend to see perhaps in England and the US. Then Singapore, Finland and Australia all place strong emphasis on students and topic-specific education, topic-specific professional knowledge compared to England and the United States. On the other hand, England is focusing on teacher beliefs and the US is focusing on curriculum. England also has a strong emphasis on curriculum. So when we think about this in terms of the rankings, we perhaps begin to see some differences here about how and why it is our students perform differently across these nations. So let's look at the next slide. So this is where I'm looking at the themes which are emerged from the document. So this is the thematic analysis. So these are the ones that came out which were not aligned with the consensus model. I wonder if there's I've missed a slide there. I usually have one which is, no, it's okay, maybe it's coming up. Okay, so not aligned with the consensus model is this set of items here. First of all, professionalism. We don't see that in the consensus model. The way it comes through in the documents is in three ways: collaboration, accountability, and development. And what I've seen is that this comes out as pre-service teachers have to collaborate, in-service teachers have to collaborate. There's accountability of the teachers to the students, applying judgment, and some notion of development relating to external bodies, and development relating to internal school-based procedures. So that's one emphasis. And here are some examples of the kinds of thing that I mean here. So in England, this notion of taking responsibility for improving learning through appropriate professional development is there. The emphasis in Australia is quite strong on collaboration. This a very significant statement in Finland is that teachers are the best judges of how students are progressing in school. I often tell people here in England that, and they get a little bit surprised at the level of professional responsibility that teachers elsewhere have. And this one also is a very interesting statement. Singapore, the emphasis is on the child-centered teacher who is attuned to the need of the child as the learner. That's a very strong emphasis there. Right, so let's look at this other aspect as non-aligned to the consensus model themes. This is behaviour. So this is students and self. So we've got this notion here of students being split into, coming through as sort of being well-being, having regard for that, developing discipline, participation, and this notion of making sure students are engaged. And self-behaviour on the part of the teacher, this notion of compliance, being compliant to policies and practices in the school or the jurisdiction where they're working, having a high degree of personal ethics, and having respect both for the students and themselves as professionals. Now, so those two aspects are not, those are non-aligned aspects of the consensus model. And what we can see here is some examples. So here's compliance in Australia, comply with legislative, administrative and organisational requirements. And this notion in the United States of accomplished teachers understanding and valuing diversity and engaging all students. And here's an emphasis on ethics. In England, teachers must have proper and professional regard for the ethos, policies and practices of the school. And then in Singapore, we come back to this notion again of the child at the centre of the learning teaching process, belief that all children can learn and commitment to nurturing the potential in each child. So these are some messages here which are emerging from those teacher education documents. So in summary then, what we're noticing is that higher performing nations seem to emphasise content knowledge and topic specific knowledge. There's a notion that pedagogy requires a knowledge of students' learning needs, actually being able to adjust pedagogy to meet the individual learning needs of each child. There's also a notion of teacher accountability, judges of student performance, collaborative, high status professionals. Again, so this is coming through from these nations which tend to be at the top of the rankings on a consistent basis. Those that are coming further down, England, USA and so on, we seem to be emphasising the focus on teachers preparing students for exams, this notion of an external assessment of teachers sort of pedagogical practices in the classroom. And teacher behaviour tends to emphasise personal ethics and beliefs rather than thinking about them as people who are working with individual students for the individual students' benefit. So perhaps what we get are these outcomes as we might expect. So let's now draw this together and have some conclusions and reflections. So if we go back to the first 6 points that I was making about that what makes great teaching paper, you can see some elements of those details in these papers and the consensus model that we've been talking about. I've also tried to place this as impact on student progress, which was the feature of Rob Coe-et-al.'s report. So we can see that if we look at teacher quality component, pedagogical content knowledge, which came at the top, it is represented in the consensus model, and of course it's not an emergent theme in policy documents. So it seems to be that the very top thing, in some of these lower jurisdictions particularly, it's not emphasised. Quality of instruction, topic-specific professional knowledge and knowledge of assessment could be deemed to be part of that, and we see that reflected as an emergent theme through student accountability and judgment. And then this notion of creating a classroom climate, that's not represented in the consensus model particularly, and we see that as an emergent theme in participation and well-being. And then going a little bit further down, we can see some variation here about how the consensus model represents classroom management, pedagogical knowledge, teacher beliefs are there as the amplifier and filter, and nothing is said about professional behaviours. But emergent themes come out in terms of managing the classroom as discipline, participation in personal ethics, and external collaboration. So we can see a bit of a mix here. This tells us that the consensus model isn't completely representative of the kinds of things that perhaps are making the biggest impact in teacher education quality. And similarly, some of our jurisdictions are missing some of the things which seem to be really important. So what do we get about this? Content and pedagogical knowledge data show that where both are high quality, the positive impact on student learning is possible, but they both need to be high quality. Where pedagogical practices are sort of low quality, but content is correct, the positive impact on student learning is unlikely, and it may be that students' learning becomes sort of rote learning rather than meaningful learning, and it makes it very exclusive to students who perhaps need to have things repeated to them a number of times, or have things presented in a variety of different ways, or have very specific learning needs which the teacher needs to address. Conversely, where pedagogy is good but content is incorrect, or where both of these are low quality, what we end up with is negative impact on student learning, and students may learn irrelevant or incorrect material. So that's actually quite a poor position to be in as a student. So perhaps what we need to think about is a professional knowledge framework which really emphasises teacher quality. And I'm putting this lecture together, I've been trying to think about what that might look like. So it seems to be that these components are perhaps the most important. Some sort of knowledge of students, topic-specific content knowledge. It's no good knowing about some topics that are in the curriculum and not others. It needs to be specific to the content that is there. Topic-specific instructional strategies, having a good all-round content knowledge so we can field students' questions and perhaps interpret and anticipate their difficulties. And then knowledge of assessment, particularly formative assessment, which tells us more about how students are getting on and how they are dealing with the kind of information that teachers are presenting to them. So I tried to build a diagram which tries to represent this. And if you remember back to the models that I presented earlier, really this is quite a simple model, and it's based more on Schulman's model than it is on the rather more complex consensus model. And also I've tried to pick out what PCK might actually be. I called it professional knowledge for teaching science to try and perhaps avoid the too powerful a label. But we can see here that what I think is important here is knowledge of students, individual learners' characteristics, prior knowledge and misconceptions about the topic, and topic-specific instructional strategies. And those are in turn influenced by topic-specific content knowledge about the curriculum and academic knowledge that the teacher may have held before he or she becomes a teacher, the curriculum which is needed to direct what is taught and is relevant. And then we've got some notion of student learning here taking place with a feedback loop via formative assessment. As I said, it's a relatively simple model. It doesn't say anything about what the teacher's standpoint or beliefs might be, but I think this, to me, drives at the heart of what good pedagogical content knowledge might look like. So what can I say about improving teacher quality? I think there is a need for us to focus ruthlessly on the knowledge that really impacts student progress. And what I'm reading in these teacher education policy documents is that a lot of times we are focusing perhaps on the wrong things or placing too much emphasis on those things, when really what we should be looking at is really strong teacher professional knowledge that really develops awareness of individual students' learning needs, knowledge of how students may address certain topics. That may be linguistically based, maybe misconceptions based, maybe both together. Where might they get their difficulties from, and how can a teacher approach those? So the strategies that a teacher has at his or her disposal to use in the classroom are really, really important. And then this notion of accountability, I think, is quite significant. Focusing relentlessly on improving practice seems to me to be important. Supporting teachers making changes to practice. There's a lot of evidence that suggests it's very difficult once a teacher is established in a certain track of behaviour and practice to get him or her to move out to doing something which perhaps might be more constructive for the student's benefit. And then I think perhaps the mentoring of new teachers may be improved, using the best teachers to educate the next generation. And I know in some jurisdictions around the world, the status of master teacher or expert teacher is used for that purpose to good effect. So I think that's really all I really wanted to say. Here's the cathedral again from a different perspective. This picture comes from the probably roughly the area of the train station, so you can see the cathedral and the castle together, which is a World Heritage Site. And then those are my contact details. So if you do want to send me an email at any point with a further question which we can't answer within the timing of this session, then feel free to do so. And then the remaining slides, another sunset picture, and then some documents which I referred to, some additional sources. So I hope that that has proved useful to you, and I think I've stopped with about 12 minutes to spare. So if we want to have any more questions, there is a little bit of time. So thank you very much.
So we've got about 10 minutes. We can take a look at some of those. There's a sort of theme here coming through about in terms of PCK for practicing teachers and issues around teaching across all three sciences, and are we expecting sort of too much for a chemist, for example, to teach in both biology and physics as well in terms of PCK?
Okay, right. So if anybody's recording this, my honest answer to that is probably the answer is yes. I think we are. I think we are expecting too much. I think there was a fashion some years ago to combine science together to create a subject called science, because there was a feeling that some subjects were losing status among particular students of particular gender in the UK. But I do think that has created a number of problems, and one of them is quality of teachers' content knowledge. I think it's an interesting practice that we have in state schools. I think it places a particular emphasis and stress on teachers who come from particular backgrounds to teach other sciences. Some teachers adapt to this better than others. I know from my own experience that when I had to teach GCSE physics in one college where I worked, I did have to keep running to the physics teacher quite frequently to get input about how to approach it. I think I was okay with the content knowledge, but it was really the pedagogy that I struggled with. And there is significant evidence, again, from around the world, which suggests that that is a problem. I think I note in the, probably in Singapore particularly, specialist teachers are specialist teachers. And I think we perhaps ought to give that careful consideration.
Okay, great. So do you think there are sort of essential components of PCK for teachers of chemistry, and also are there overlapping areas of PCK between the different sciences?
Okay. Right, I think there are certain things which I think are overlapping, and some of those are an approach to inquiry-based science. I think it's important that students gain an experience of science as an inquiry subject. It's not something, it's a combination of fact and also this notion of creating this view that science is open, and it's open to challenge, open to new developments, open to sort of new ways of thinking, and allowing students to be able to access that idea that not everything is there's one right answer for everything is quite important. So that overlaps all sciences. I think also the notion that scientific experiments aren't necessarily just done in 10 or 20 minutes in a lesson and that's it. that actually we should have a notion of experiments taking time to take place, and this idea that we come back to visit things, I think is quite significant. The idea of children being resilient and raising questions for themselves about scientific practice, and knowing where their data is reliable and knowing what questions to ask about it, I think is also something that overlaps the different three sciences. And science out of school. I could go on about this for quite a long time. So in terms of chemistry being specific, I think one of the key things that I've always felt was important to chemistry is getting students to understand. We're talking about some events which occur at sub-microscopic level. And I always say physics is about the nuclei and chemistry is about the electrons. But getting students to understand that we've got sub-microscopic events taking place and getting them to I always think about molecular spectacles. I always say that I keep molecular spectacles, and I'll pull them out my notebook pocket, put them on, and I'll say we're now looking through molecular spectacles at what's going on here, to try and get students to see that. That to me is the key to understanding chemistry.
So on that, in terms of at primary level, are you aware of much research done on PCK in terms of teaching chemistry at primary level, and perhaps in relation to that sub-microscopic level?
Okay, well, I think that there is some work about how materials behave, and this idea that we can make materials change, adapt and alter. That there was a big project that was run for quite a number of years in primary science about different phenomena. And so one of those was evaporation. And one of the famous quotes in that was collected from very young children was that evaporation means sort of something breaking up into tiny micro bits. So I think if we think of it as too difficult, I think we're sort of underestimating what children can actually understand. I think it is possible for children to imagine things that they perhaps can't see, and that we have got techniques and language to use for trying to help them understand that microscopic or sub-microscopic set of events that are taking place. There's quite a body of work there which I think could be drawn on.
Great, thank you. So shift to a methodology question here, and someone's asked, could you talk a bit more about your methods and how you ensured the trustworthiness of your emergent themes and conclusions?
Oh, okay. Right, that's an interesting question. I think what I did there was I did a lot of reading and rereading. I've also shared these now with quite a number of people around the world, and nobody has yet challenged me on them. So I think that if anybody wants to do that, I'm open to discussion about it. So I've sort of tested them. I've kind of stress tested them by talking about them in a number of different places, and I think people seem to think that those were reasonable statements. And obviously what I've done in this talk is quoted snippets of information. So in a full paper which I'm still in the process of writing, there will be rather more sort of sourced evidence. So I think you just need to take the slide that I've given there as with a little bit of caution, because it is just a small quote. But I think I'm reasonably confident that those themes are pretty robust.
Great, thank you very much. Couple of questions here really interested sort of in terms of successful teacher training. So in terms of how do we help trainees and teachers evaluate their content knowledge, sort of their own awareness of that, in terms of so they can then develop good PCK, and also in relation to sort of teacher training and contact time that someone has in terms of when they're doing the training, and the balance there in terms of their reflection on their teaching.
Okay, right, to take the second one first, my thinking is that I don't think we do enough now on actually preparing trainee teachers for the kind of, in terms of the pedagogical content knowledge they actually need. I think we've gone too far the other way, which is exactly where Schulman started in 1985 when he made his presidential address to I just momentarily slipped my mind what the organisation was, but he made this presidential address and talked about how teacher education had got filled up with all sorts of other stuff, but he had missed the heart of it. And I think certainly in England now we have got to that point. We have filled up teacher education, certainly on the PGC, with so much other stuff, and we've relied heavily on this master-apprentice model. And I think teachers can only get so far with that. We need to do much, much more in working out what are the actual best strategies to really develop students' understanding of some really quite tricky science concepts that they really have to know. We've also gone too far to technicalise assessment, and so the assessment now is out of the hands of teachers largely, and I feel that we've lost that concept of professional judgment, and I would like to see that reinstated. Compared to when I started, I'm going to do my sort of when I was young sort of thing now. 30 odd years ago, that was the case. I was taught how to do teacher demonstrations. So Dick Ingle from the Nuffield project stood in front of us and said, "This is how to demonstrate these reactions, the fountain experiment, and so on." We did a different one every week, so we learned the pedagogy of how to do it, the questions to ask, how to approach it, what to do, and we were informed about that, so we could still carry on and do it in the classroom. And that kind of thing, I think, is minimised now. I wouldn't say it doesn't exist, I would say it's minimised. To go back to the first question about how teachers can develop their content knowledge, in chemistry, I designed quite a large set of multiple choice questions which can be used to assess content knowledge. They should be available on the Royal Society of Chemistry's LearnNet website. There are about 400 odd questions at different levels on about 10 or 11, 12 different topics in chemistry. So those can be used to sort of help test content knowledge and really develop that further. And they were misconceptions-based questions. So people who are coming to teach chemistry from a different background, who are perhaps slightly rusty on their chemistry knowledge, can use those as a basis.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, well, time is getting short, but we'll try and fit in one or two more. So there's a question here in relation to PCK, levels of PCK and teacher retention. And someone,
sorry, Simon, just a we'll probably have one more question, then we'll have to wrap it up, I think.
Right.
Just getting close to the hour.
Yeah. Okay, so just in terms of, is there a link between level of PCK and teacher retention? Someone has commented that they think that those with strong PCK are most demoralised.
Oh, okay. Right. I'd be interested to talk to that person. I'm not sure what the evidence for that is. I don't really have that kind of evidence, and possibly it depends a little bit on the context in which that teacher is working. I'm feeling that a lack of support from senior leaders in the school where he or she is, or where a group of teachers might be working. I could see that perhaps where teachers feel they're doing a very good job, not being appropriately rewarded for it. But other than that, I haven't seen that kind of evidence coming through in the literature.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's brilliant. Thank you very much for your thought-provoking talk there.
Okay, yes, well, and thank you to Simon for chairing and for fielding a very, very busy list of questions. Clearly a very a talk that generated a lot of discussion and interest. So thank you very much, Vanessa, to you for your time in preparing this talk.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you to all who listened in. I really enjoyed doing it. So thank you once again.
Great. And just to advertise that our next talk in the series is Santiago Sandoval from University of Costa Rica. Many of you may be familiar with his work in laboratory education. So he's going to give us some information next month on the 24th of October, a little bit about phenomenology as a technique, and then how he's used this approach in looking at college chemistry laboratory. But can you just join me in thanking Vanessa virtually, applause around the world, for a really stimulating and interesting talk around very interesting topic of pedagogical content knowledge. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you. No, it's fantastic. So what I'll be able to do is, well, you're free to browse it yourself, but I'll be able to copy the chat text, so you'll be able to have a look at some of the comments and interests. So a lot of I think you resonated with a lot of people in the characteristics of good teaching slide. That seemed to really capture people's attention. So thank you very much.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. You're welcome, Michael.
Okay, so
Okay.
I will.